December 17, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe is racing through the snow-covered Belgian countryside. They've punched through American lines in the opening hours of what will become known as the Battle of the Bulge. His column of Panther tanks, Tiger IIs, and half-tracks is supposed to reach the Meuse River in 2 days, a distance of about 50 miles. But Peiper has a massive problem. His tanks are nearly out of fuel. The German operational plan for the Ardennes offensive counted on capturing American fuel dumps. The panzer columns were supposed to refuel from captured supplies as they advanced, just like the old days of Blitzkrieg when German forces captured Soviet fuel depots and kept moving. Peiper's fuel situation is critical. His Panthers are consuming fuel faster than expected in the difficult terrain and snow. Some tanks are already running on fumes. If they don't find fuel in the next few hours, the entire Kampfgruppe will grind to a halt. Then his lead elements report something. An American fuel depot near the town of Bullingen, defended but not heavily. The Americans are in disarray from the surprise attack. Peiper orders an immediate assault. Within an hour, the depot is in German hands. Peiper walks through the facility and stops dead. Row after row of fuel drums, thousands of them, stacked neatly, organized systematically, ready for distribution. His logistics officer does a quick inventory and reports back. Approximately 50,000 gallons of fuel, enough to refuel Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe and then some. Peiper should be elated. This is exactly what the operational plan counted on. But as he stands there, looking at this enormous quantity of American fuel, something clicks in his mind. This isn't just one depot. The Americans have these all over Belgium, all over France, scattered across the entire front. And this is just what they've left behind in their withdrawal. For the first time, Peiper truly understands what Germany is fighting against, and he realizes they've already lost. Joachim Peiper was 29 years old in December 1944, but he was already a veteran of some of the most brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. He joined the SS in 1934 at age 19. By 1938, he was serving on Heinrich Himmler's personal staff. When the war started, he transferred to the Waffen-SS combat units, specifically the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart Adolf Hitler, the elite unit that served as Hitler's bodyguard division. Peiper saw combat in Poland, France, and the Balkans, but it was on the Eastern Front that he made his reputation. He commanded armor units in the invasion of the Soviet Union, fighting at Kiev, Moscow, Kharkov, and Kursk. He was known for aggressive tactics, rapid movement, and a willingness to take risks that other commanders avoided. By December 1944, he commanded Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group of about 5,000 men with 72 tanks, including King Tigers and Panthers, plus assault guns, half-tracks, and supporting vehicles. It was one of the spearhead units for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive. Peiper was a true believer in the Nazi cause and in German military superiority. He'd seen German forces defeat larger Soviet armies through superior tactics and fighting spirit. He believed Germany could still win the war if they could knock the Western Allies out of the fight, forcing them to negotiate. The Ardennes plan made sense to him. Punch through weak American positions in Belgium, drive to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force the British and Americans to sue for peace. Then Germany could focus all resources on fighting the Soviets. It was Germany's last chance, but Peiper believed it could work. Then he captured that fuel depot at Billingen. The attack on Billingen began early on December 17th. Piper's lead elements reached the town around 8 a.m. American forces there were from rear echelon units, engineers, supply troops, headquarters personnel. They weren't prepared for a major attack. The German assault was swift. Piper's tanks rolled through the town, scattering American resistance. Some Americans fought back with small arms and bazookas, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Within 2 hours, Billingen was in German hands. Piper immediately sent teams to search for supplies. They found the fuel depot on the southern edge of town. It was a U.S. Army quartermaster depot, part of the vast supply network supporting First Army operations. The depot wasn't a large permanent facility, just a field dump where fuel was stored for distribution to forward units. But the quantity was staggering to German eyes. The depot contained approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline in 5-gallon jerrycans, additional fuel in 55-gallon drums, lubricants, oil and maintenance supplies, the infrastructure to pump and distribute fuel quickly. Piper's logistics officer, Karl Rettlinger, organized the refueling operation. German soldiers rolled fuel drums to the tanks and half-tracks. They transferred fuel from American jerrycans into German vehicles. The refueling took hours. You can't quickly transfer 50,000 gallons into dozens of vehicles with hand pumps and gravity feeds. But by early afternoon, Kampfgruppe Piper was refueled. Tanks that had been running on fumes now had full tanks. Piper had enough fuel to continue the advance for at least another day, maybe 2 if they moved efficiently. The operational plan was working. They'd captured enemy fuel, just as intended. The Kampfgruppe could continue driving toward the Meuse. But Piper couldn't shake what he'd seen at that depot. The sheer quantity, the organization, the fact that the Americans had simply left it behind during their retreat, not destroyed, not evacuated, just abandoned because there was more where that came from. As Piper watched his tanks being refueled from captured American supplies, several things became clear to him. First, the quality of the fuel. American gasoline was superior to what Germany was producing in late 1944. German synthetic fuel production was suffering from Allied bombing, and the quality had declined. German tanks were running on fuel that was inconsistent in octane rating, contaminated with impurities, damaging to engines. The American fuel was clean, consistent, high octane. Piper's drivers reported that their engines ran smoother, more powerfully on American gasoline. This wasn't just about quantity. The Americans had better fuel quality than Germany could produce. Second, the logistics system. The depot at Billingen was organized with military precision. Fuel drums were stacked systematically. Inventory records were clear. Distribution systems were in place. Even in retreat, even abandoning the depot, the Americans had maintained organizational standards. Piper had seen German supply dumps on the Eastern Front. By 1944, they were chaotic. Fuel mixed with ammunition, poor inventory control, supplies scattered without organization. The Wehrmacht's logistics system was breaking down under strain. But the Americans, even at a small field depot, maintained standards that German forces could no longer match. Third, the scale. 50,000 gallons was enough to refuel Piper's entire Kampfgruppe. But he knew from intelligence reports that this was one small depot among hundreds. The Americans had fuel depots like this scattered across Belgium and France. They even had larger facilities at ports and major supply hubs. Piper did the math. If one small field depot contained enough fuel for a German armored Kampfgruppe, How much fuel did the Americans have in total? Millions of gallons, maybe tens of millions. Quantities that Germany couldn't match, even if all its synthetic fuel plants were operating at full capacity, which they weren't because of Allied bombing. Fourth, the casualness. The Americans had abandoned this fuel without destroying it. They had withdrawn from Boulingen so quickly that they didn't even torch the depot. This wasn't because of panic or poor discipline. It was because they could afford to. They had so much fuel that losing 50,000 gallons barely mattered. Piper thought about Germany's fuel situation. Every gallon was precious. Panzer units were being kept out of combat to conserve fuel. Training for new tank crews had been drastically reduced because they couldn't spare fuel for exercises. The Luftwaffe was grounded much of the time because of fuel shortages. And here were the Americans leaving 50,000 gallons behind because it wasn't worth the time to destroy it. Fifth, the implications. The Ardennes offensive was supposed to capture American fuel dumps and use them to sustain the advance. And it was working. Piper had just refueled his Kampfgruppe from captured supplies. But even as he succeeded in executing the plan, Piper realized the plan itself was insane. Germany was launching a major offensive that depended on capturing enemy fuel because Germany didn't have enough fuel of its own. That wasn't a war-winning strategy. That was desperation. That was an admission that Germany couldn't sustain offensive operations with its own resources. And the Americans? They had so much fuel that they could sustain multiple army groups across hundreds of miles of front, maintain continuous air operations, and still have enough left over to abandon 50,000 gallons without a second thought.
Despite Piper's growing doubts, the advance continued. Refueled, Kampfgruppe Piper pushed westward. Over the next several days, Piper's force drove deeper into Belgium. They captured more American supply dumps, though none as large as Boulingen. They encountered scattered American resistance and swept it aside. They advanced over 30 miles in the first 3 days, an impressive rate for winter operations in difficult terrain. But problems multiplied. The roads were narrower than expected, creating massive traffic jams. Piper's heavy King Tiger tanks were too wide for many Belgian roads and had to push through, damaging the road surfaces and slowing the entire column. American engineers had blown bridges, forcing time-consuming detours. Fuel consumption was higher than planned. The Panthers and King Tigers were fuel-hungry beasts, even in ideal conditions. In snow, on narrow roads, constantly stopping and starting, they consumed fuel at terrifying rates. The 50,000 gallons captured at Boulingen were gone within 2 days. Piper captured more fuel at Stavelot, another American dump, smaller but still substantial. But it wasn't enough. The advance was consuming more fuel than they could capture. Piper's tanks were running low again. By December 19, Kampfgruppe Piper reached L'Église, about 20 miles short of the Meuse River. They should have been at the river by now. They should have crossed it and been driving toward Antwerp. Instead, they were stuck in a small Belgian town surrounded by American forces that were regrouping faster than expected. Piper sent increasingly desperate messages to division headquarters requesting fuel. The responses were vague. Fuel was being sent forward, maintain position, continue the offensive. But no fuel arrived. The supply lines that were supposed to support the advance had broken down. Roads were clogged with vehicles. American air attacks had resumed as weather cleared. Allied artillery was interdicting German supply routes. By December 21, Piper was completely out of fuel. His tanks sat idle. American forces were closing in from multiple directions. He was surrounded, cut off, with no fuel,
dwindling ammunition, and no chance of relief. Piper made the decision to abandon his vehicles and break out on foot. On December 23rd, Kampfgruppe Piper destroyed their tanks, vehicles, and equipment that they couldn't carry and withdrew through American lines at night. Of the 5,000 men who'd started the offensive, about 800 made it back to German lines.
After the war, Piper was in prison for war crimes, specifically the Malmedy massacre, where his troops murdered American prisoners. During interrogations and later interviews, Piper spoke about the Ardennes offensive and what he'd learned from it. He described finding that fuel depot at Bullingen and how it had affected his thinking. Several quotes from his interrogations and later statements capture his perspective. "When I saw that depot, I understood for the first time what we were fighting against. Not just American soldiers, but American industrial capacity. They could afford to leave 50,000 gallons behind. We were launching our last offensive and depending on capturing enemy fuel to sustain it. The quality of their fuel was better than ours. Our synthetic fuel was damaging our own engines. Their fuel was clean, high octane, better than what we'd used even in 1940. That told me everything about which side had the resources to win. I realized that even if we captured Antwerp, even if we split the Allied armies, we couldn't sustain it. We didn't have the fuel for a sustained offensive. We were operating on captured supplies and hope. That's not how you win wars." Other German officers who participated in the Ardennes offensive reported similar realizations. General Hasso von Mantelfern, commanding 5th Panzer Army, wrote after the war, "The failure to capture American fuel dumps in sufficient quantity doomed the offensive from the start. But even as we captured fuel, I understood that we were stealing from an enemy who had unlimited supplies while we had none." Colonel Otto Skorzeny, who led special operations during the offensive, stated, "We captured American supply dumps and were amazed at what we found. Not just the quantity, but the quality and organization. It was clear that we were fighting an enemy who operated on a scale we couldn't match." What Piper and other German officers observed wasn't just about fuel. It was about the fundamental asymmetry of the war by late 1944. Germany was scraping together fuel from synthetic plants that were being bombed regularly. The Germans were running tanks on coal-derived gasoline that damaged engines. They were rationing fuel so severely that pilot training was cut to dangerous minimums and panzer divisions sat idle. The Americans were producing crude oil at rates of over 4 million barrels per day. That's 168 million gallons per day. The U.S. had so much oil that they were exporting it to Britain and Soviet Union while simultaneously fueling their own massive military operations in Europe and the Pacific. American fuel supplies in Europe in December 1944 were measured in millions of gallons, stored at multiple locations. The entire German fuel reserve for the Ardennes offensive was about 5 million gallons, and that was considered barely adequate for the operation. The 50,000 gallons Piper captured represented about 1% of Germany's entire fuel allocation for the offensive. For the Americans, it was a rounding error.
The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, ultimately failed. German forces created a bulge in the Allied lines but couldn't reach their objectives. By January 1945, American and British forces had pushed the Germans back to their starting positions. German casualties were approximately 100,000 men. They lost over 800 tanks and assault guns. They consumed virtually all the fuel that had been scraped together for the offensive. and they gained nothing. No territorial conquests, no strategic advantages, no change in the war's trajectory. Piper survived the war, but was convicted for the Malmedy massacre and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1956 and lived in France until 1976, when he was killed by unknown assailants, possibly revenge for wartime actions. In his later years, Piper gave several interviews about his wartime experiences. He repeatedly returned to that moment at Bullingen, finding the American fuel depot and understanding what it meant. "I was a National Socialist, a believer in the cause," he said in a 1960s interview. "But I was also a soldier, and soldiers understand logistics. When I saw what the Americans could afford to abandon, I understood that we'd lost the war. Not lost a battle, lost the war. We were fighting an enemy who had so much material abundance that they could be careless with it." Other German commanders echoed this perspective. After the war, when German generals were interviewed about why Germany lost, many pointed to material factors: Allied bombing, industrial capacity, resources. The United States could produce, transport, and distribute supplies on a scale that Germany couldn't match. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall German commander in the West during the Ardennes offensive, stated bluntly, "The offensive failed because we ran out of fuel. We ran out of fuel because we didn't have enough to begin with. We didn't have enough because Germany's resources were exhausted and America's were unlimited." December 17, 1944. A German colonel captures an American fuel depot. 50,000 gallons, enough to refuel his entire Kampfgruppe. It should have been a triumph, proof that the operational plan could work, that German forces could sustain their offensive on captured supplies. And tactically, it was a success. Piper's tanks got the fuel they needed to continue the advance. But standing in that depot, looking at the rows of fuel drums, the organized inventory, the systematic storage, Joachim Piper understood something that changed his entire perception of the war. Germany was fighting a war it couldn't win, not because of tactics or fighting spirit or military skill, but because of basic mathematics. Germany didn't have the resources to sustain major offensive operations. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last great attack, depended on stealing fuel from the enemy to keep moving. And the enemy could afford to leave 50,000 gallons behind without worrying about it, because they had millions more where that came from. Piper was a war criminal, responsible for the murder of American prisoners. But he was also an experienced officer who understood military logistics. And in that moment at Bullingen, he saw the truth clearly. The Americans weren't just fighting with more tanks or more planes or more men. They were fighting with an industrial and logistical capacity so overwhelming that they could be wasteful and still win. They could leave supplies behind during retreats. They could consume fuel at rates that seemed insane to German planners. They could keep multiple army groups supplied across hundreds of miles of front while simultaneously fighting a war in the Pacific. Germany couldn't match that. Germany couldn't even compete with it. Germany was running on fumes, literally, while the Americans were drowning in resources. The Ardennes offensive would fail, not because German soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because you can't run tanks without fuel, and Germany didn't have enough fuel to sustain the offensive. Capturing American dumps helped temporarily, but it wasn't a solution. It was a band-aid on a fatal wound. Piper knew it the moment he saw those 50,000 gallons. Germany was doomed.